we view energy as sort of the master currency.
What are the big misconceptions that people have about the energy market?
There's this belief that energy is sort of an old commodity sector that doesn't have much in the way of technological innovation and so on. But most importantly, they believe in what I would call sort of perpetual motion machines, that you can ignore the energy required to create a solar panel and just assume that once you've created that solar panel, of course, the energy will pay itself back and everything is great. As much money as we've spent on renewables, the market share of fossil fuels is unchanged over the decades, effectively.
G'day, Money Miners. Thursday, 27th of July, and we've got a special treat from far across the ditch. These we're expanding out here, boys. This one's, important to us in the terms of good content, but these are another mob that have actually been a startup, success, and absolutely killing it in the news publication for the energy industry, you'd say.
I find you're so much more interested in their business model than their content, man.
Yeah, just tell me how to fucking make money, boys.
Why will our audience care about Doomberg?
Oh, yeah, sorry, on to the money miners. Sorry, money gives me a bit of a stiffy. Mate, Doomberg. Did they take it from Bloomberg at all? It sounds very...
They did not.
Doomsday, don't know. Doomberg, massive in the substack scene. So they've got a substack for, I guess, news articles for energy, real focus on energy, global, macro side of things, and they have absolutely taken off. 170,000 male subscribers.
They do a great job. So they started their content-based business, their newsletter-focused 3 odd years ago. And like you said, energy, finance, economy at large is how they sort of style and what they write about. And yeah, I think they do some super interesting stuff. I'm sure our listeners, the money miners, will get a good feel for that in the episode if they haven't come across them yet. I'm super excited. It was awesome that we could snag them for an interview.
Yeah, and these themes around energy are feeding a lot of the mining markets at the moment. You've got the transition to renewables. It has a big implication on the energy markets in the sense of the critical minerals required. You've got the rising relevance of nuclear, and you've got, coal is having a bit of a renaissance as people realise the transition isn't happening so fast. All of that plays into this conversation.
I couldn't agree more. These issues cannot be underlined any more than they are. They are massive, and especially to investors in the space, in natural resources. We're talking about uranium here. We're talking about the whole complex of critical metals needed for the energy transition. And yeah, the guys at Doomberg just do a great job covering the space, and I think the money miners get a lot of value from the conversation.
Guys, maybe girls, they're a pseudonym.
It's a green chicken.
They're an enigmatic business. So you'll see a little green chicken fluffing on the screen, and he's got a chicken voice too. So no, righto, lads. I reckon we get into it, eh? Right. First up, thanks to the boys at Terra Capital for partnering up with Money of Mine, Bondi, and Matty Langsford. And that chat we had with Matty a while ago, a lot of parallels to this chat we have with Doomberg about the uranium scene in specific. So,
super insightful. Appreciate the support, guys.
Good on you guys.
Good on you, Terra. Let's rip it. Here we go, money miners. Righto, g'day, money miners. Geez, another North American field today, boys. We had Rick Rule the other day. We've digressed away from the metalliferous mining industry, and we've got some absolute rip snorters of pseudonym, you'd say. The Satoshi Nakamoto of the energy business, you would say, Doomberg. And you can see on the video here this little flopping chicken around. Doomberg, welcome to Money of Mine, mate.
Gentlemen, pleasure to be here. It's quite a unique experience, I must say. I love Australia. Every time I visited, I had a grand old time, and looking forward to a fantastic discussion today.
Mate, I'm giving you a full dose of it tonight from myself. Now, this Doomberg, this little chicken you got going in this, you aren't running like a bit of a Daft Punk setup and you've got about 10 different people doing it behind this chicken, are we? Is it the same Doomberg every time?
If we had 10 people, we'd be far more prolific. We're a surprisingly small team. But as you mentioned, we choose to identify as a slightly blinking, subtly moving green chicken. And in 2023, that's our right.
Before we get into the JD and travel, flick all the interesting hard questions at you, I'll yous were a success story out of COVID, and yous have absolutely gone gangbusters in the energy industry. And now, look, we're a bit of a metalliferous mining podcast. So, look, give a bit of a brief spiel to introduce yourself to our listeners, and you might pull up a few more subscribers in Australia, hopefully, Cobber.
Well, in fact, we have a fair bit of subscribers from Australia because of our long association with none other than Grant Williams, who is, of course, deeply connected to the country and has a daughter who lives there, I believe. But yeah, on background, we are a very small team that comes from industry, senior executives in the commodity sector with several decades of experience. Started Doomberg, as you mentioned, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 lockdowns. And we write from the perspective of people who have industrial experience, which is pretty rare in the content space, especially in the energy sector, where executives are loath to say anything in public that might be deemed to be controversial. They often speak through professional public relations teams and so on, and we suffer from no such constraints. We write about energy, finance, and the economy at large. Started with no social media following and no audience whatsoever, but have systematically through good discipline and business execution and producing the highest quality work we can. We have built up over 250,000 followers on Twitter and something around 175,000 email subscribers on Substack, and it's been an amazing whirlwind. And we publish 5 to 8 pieces a month. Just put one out this morning before we hit record, which is great because that means I get to relax today. And so it's been a blast, and it's truly the work of my life. And one of our strong beliefs is that when you find what you were meant to be doing in life, you just keep doing it.
His is energy is life. And I just want to hear you give the quick overview and then sort of hear how this sort of philosophy makes you think about energy markets.
Yeah, energy is life is the sort of condensed version, the most condensed version we could come up with to describe Yakov's Meal's great body of work. And really, we and many others in the energy sector owe a great debt of gratitude to his fine work. His book, Energy and Civilization, really shaped the way we thought about energy when we first read it. Energy is life stands for the fact that disorder is spontaneous, and the universe is hurtling to higher and higher states of disorder. And in order to beat back the forces of entropy, humans must waste heat in order to impose order on their local environment. That's sort of a technical physics way to describe what is commonly known as your standard of living. Right angles do not appear spontaneously in nature. You must impose them upon nature. And if you stop putting energy into your local environment, it will very quickly decay into higher and higher states of disorder. And so by definition, and quite literally, your standard of living is defined by how much energy you get to waste. And when I say waste, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. You must waste heat in order to impose order. Order is your standard of living. All humans everywhere want a higher standard of living, which is why energy is so critical to the economy. And our integrated standard of living across society is measured by the excess energy we get to extract and utilize for such purposes. And how that gets distributed, of course, leads to income inequality and so on. But at the highest level, energy is in fact life, and the more energy we produce, the more life-nourishing energy we can spread across the 8 billion of us on this little blue planet.
Was this philosophy a big driver in why you started Doomberg, or was this something you've obviously had a lot of years in the industry prior to this? But was that a big catalyst? This belief as a bit of a business plan in a way?
The belief, well, first of all, we would never write anything we don't 100% believe to be true the moment we've written it. And the market inefficiency that we observed in the content creator space, because I should say, before we launched Doomberg, we had a couple of years of experience. We run a small consulting firm, a bespoke consulting firm in our real lives, was the primary focus before Doomberg, and has now obviously taken a backseat to Doomberg as Doomberg has succeeded beyond the scale of our consulting business. But we spent a couple of years consulting in the content creator space, helping people who create and sell content into Wall Street run their businesses better. And one of the things we observed while studying that market for our clients is there was a huge inefficiency in the sense that the energy discussion, there were lots of people who understood how energy really worked, but very few of them were in the content space. There were very few people successfully doing content who truly understood how energy worked. And there were none of them that we could find. The overlap in the Venn diagram between doing well in content understanding how energy worked, and had the industrial background and perspective to give. And so we occupy the center of that three-circle Venn diagram, and that was, that was the dream, that we could do this. Of course, never in our wildest dreams did we imagine that we would blow up in the way in which we did. I would say the biggest piece of advice I could give anybody trying to do anything is mindset of continuous improvement. We have really attacked with a significant amount of discipline the execution of all aspects of this as a business, which we have described it as such to our subscribers from the very first pieces. And I can't read the earliest pieces today because it's unreadable to my eyes given the quality of the product today versus what we were first putting out. But that is, of course, testimony to the sweat equity and mindset of continuous improvement and discipline that we put into this project. And I'll finish this answer by saying, even in 2023, no matter what business you're in, disciplined execution is still a durable moat.
Doomberg, just to pick up on one of your threads there, I think our audience is super interested in the energy complex, especially to the extent it flows through to uranium, to coal, and to a lesser extent to oil and gas as well. But what are the big three misconceptions that people, or misunderstandings that people have about the energy market?
I would say the first and most important one is people do not have, well, when I say people, I mean sort of our political leadership or our sort of elite cocktail party class. There's this belief that energy is sort of an old commodity sector that doesn't have much in the way of technological innovation and so on. But most importantly, they believe in what I would call sort of perpetual motion machines, that you can ignore the energy required to create a solar panel and just assume that once you've created that solar panel, of course, the energy will pay itself back and everything is great. When in reality, the vast amount of energy that goes into producing, solar grade polysilicon, for example, has to be paid for upfront. And so we view energy as sort of the master currency. And in the same way that you could create a net present value financial model for an investment, you must do a net present energy value model for all human activities. And the net amount of energy you produce actually dictates your standard of living, to the first answer around energy is life. And so this belief that we can somehow avoid that upfront T equals zero energy payment as we try to rewire the energy infrastructure on the planet has led to what we believe are terrible energy policies, especially in the West. Such policies are the luxuries of the rich. And we're squandering much of that wealth chasing perpetual motion machines, in our view.
So going deeper on energy now, and I want to start with nuclear, Doomberg. So you've described in the past a sort of maximum pain that kind of needs to be felt before the shortcomings of renewables are realised. Is there any alternative to this before politicians and governments and so on realise there are shortcomings and turn to something like nuclear?
It's a great question, and we just published a piece this morning about 3 hours before we hit record called Cheat Codes.
I think that was one of the four that JD didn't open.
Actually, I can tell you that he has in fact opened that one. I can tell you the exact moment that he did, if you're interested. It is quite amazing. It's quite amazing the attribution that you can get for through your statistics here, But Cheat Codes describes how Ontario went through that cycle starting in 2009. And the province of Ontario, for those listening, already operated one of the greenest grids in the developed world. It got most of its electricity from nuclear and the balance of it predominantly from hydroelectric power dams. But in 2009, the Liberal Party of Ontario decided in its infinite wisdom to pass something that has become known as the Green Energy Act. And in so doing, set about the task of wasting 60 billion Canadian dollars in the process. And by 2018, the Liberal Party was handed the single greatest electoral defeat in the history of the province. They had a 160 low in number of seats that they won. They didn't even qualify for official party status based on the results. They were completely wiped out. And Doug Ford and the Progressive Conservatives, which to our U.S. audience seems like an oxymoron, swept into power and have set about the task of re-engaging with physics. A flurry of announcements this week, a new large reactor going into the Bruce Power site, a quadrupling of the number of SMRs they're building at the Darlington site, significant progress on the refurbishment of the Pickering nuclear power plant, and on it goes. And what happened, of course, is there was a huge amount of pain. And just to give you some calibration, on a per capita basis, 60 billion Canadian is the equivalent of the US wasting $1 trillion. They just blew all this money on feed-in tariff contracts that enriched all manner of cronies at the expense of the taxpayer, and the whole effort just dissolved into a heaping pile of grift and mismanagement. I think we said in the piece, the money was torched in a volcano of fraud, and that is just the cycle until an pain is felt. The luxury of the rich is to pretend like you can run these perpetual motion machines. Once the fallacy of such assumptions and the almost universal truism that central planning doesn't work becomes real to the voters, they revolt. In this case, it was a peaceful revolt. It was an electoral revolt. Won't always be that way. But in the end, once we've tried all of the dumb ideas, you end up getting serious about which are the good ones. And physics didn't change in Ontario, just its politics. And when you look at the energy questions through the lens of physics, you inevitably end up at the highest energy density form possible, which in this case, of course, is fission. And this is why we are bullish uranium, as I'm sure many of the listeners to your show are as well.
Now, JD has informed me that the uranium, your thoughts are that about the relevancy of the uranium price, whereas I guess nothing motivates uranium companies more to mine uranium than a bloody high price. I guess where does your basis come to for that thought?
The price of uranium is interesting relative to the other commodities, predominantly because it's such a minor input into the cost of nuclear, which is both good and bad. That means, of course, the price of uranium could double or triple and nobody would care. Whereas if the price of oil doubles or triples, people panic and the economy, heads into a tail. On the flip side, it is a terribly poorly developed market relative to the other commodities. Even on Bloomberg today, it's hard to get a daily price of uranium, whereas I have all manner of minute by minute prices of oil and natural gas in various regions and various contracts and various wellheads and so on. Like down, you could buy options and futures and there's ETF. Like the trading landscape for all other commodities beyond uranium is so much more developed. It's crazy. I think I saw a quote the other day that the total market value of all uranium stocks is something like $800 million. It's a pittance. I mean, that doesn't capture the bid-ask spread between Tesla,
That can't be right.
on any given
that's right.
trading day. I saw it from a pretty good. I thought Peter Atwater put it out, $800 million for the total sum of the market cap of uranium miners.
No way. I can.
That can't be.
I can list it. I can list some that have a bigger market cap. Paladin.
Yes,
Next Gen.
Is
it perhaps because they're not producing yet?
Undeveloped.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I
can
could see Cameco has 14 billion. So you're right. Forget that number. It's a pittance compared to the other commodities. You would agree. But yeah, let's not put wrong information out there. Good correction. But what does the investment universe look like? For uranium. The only thing that really is available for people is the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust. If you want to invest directly in the commodity itself, there's a few other smaller ones. But it's just so tiny compared to oil, compared to natural gas, compared to coal, that it is truly just a developing market.
And there's one more sort of niche point on uranium when we did a bit of a dig into it a couple of weeks ago and did an episode on it, and that's around enrichment. So 1/3 of that sort of lies in Russia, but I think you've made the point in the past that that's really not a big deal. Why is that not such a big deal from your point of view?
Well, when I look at so what you're talking about is the fact that enriched uranium is required for fourth generation nuclear reactors and SMRs. And today Russia has a monopoly position vis-a-vis commercial enrichment. We would argue that replicating those capabilities is measured on the order of single-digit billions, and the U.S. is putting a fire hose of $600 billion or more in the Inflation Reduction. And we would also say that the U.S. military probably has a pretty good idea on how to do this. And so we don't. well, let's put it this way. In our view, if the West got serious about the developing the plant infrastructure that would require elevated amounts of enriched uranium, the lack of current commercial capacity to do so outside of Russia will not be constraining. It just doesn't sound like a very tough problem for us to solve if we had the political motivation to do so. It's not. Yes, today there's an issue. And by the way, we've not sanctioned that enriched uranium, and it's still, to the best of our knowledge, sort of flowing. But there's some concern that this might be an issue. But in our view, it's not something that is going to be a showstopper in any way, shape, or form, especially given the relatively long time horizons for the development of Greenfield nuclear facilities.
I reckon this is a great time to talk about uranium because for the Doomberg, you wouldn't believe it, but tomorrow is Travis's birthday. And I was actually thinking of making him a yellow cake.
Wash it down with copious amounts of water, Travis.
Oh, mate, I'll be radiating with glee.
What about these the SMRs? We JD dove into it in our little uranium talk, the small modular reactors. I'm pretty sure I got that bloody right. What go into them a bit, I guess, and the role they're going to play. Are they going to sort of remove that stigma a bit of, you know, Chernobyl and Fukushima, or is it much more than that? Is it more the practicalities, or is that stigma going to play a part in the adoption of uranium?
It's amazing. We're working on a piece now. Not sure if we'll ever publish it. Sort of tentative title is Frame of Reference, where we talk about just how crazy people are about radiation and the level of fear that has been instilled through a very effective propaganda campaign, an anti-nuclear propaganda campaign over the decades. You know, we tell this story of a very large dam collapse in China in 1975, and estimates range, but the number of people killed by that dam, which was, you know, in addition to controlling floodwaters, producing hydroelectric power, was something around the order of a 250,000 people. The estimates range from 25,000 to 240,000, at least if Wikipedia is to be believed. We don't talk about shutting down all hydroelectric power dams in the world because we had this terrible accident in China in the 70s, and they continue to happen, of course, around the world. You know, we've had train derailments carrying oil in the middle of a small town in Quebec that killed dozens of people and, you know, destroyed homes and was a real tragedy. We don't stop using oil because of that. And yet the number of people who have been injured by nuclear waste is, I believe, precisely zero. We are unable to find a single example of a person injured by nuclear waste. Nobody died because of Fukushima. These are accidents. Accidents happen. They can be managed. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. And so what are the trade-offs we're willing to make? Clearly, for hydroelectric power, you know, the collapse of the dam in China didn't cause a global moratorium on the development of that technology or the implementation of it. And yet, any tiny accident in the nuclear sector is blown out of all proportion and used to scare people away from what is truly the only plausible energy solution that works at scale if you're concerned about carbon emissions.
Is it due to the need, but like you think they didn't shut every mine in Brazil when the Vale's tailings dam wall collapsed either, because the world needs iron ore. Is that whole thing going to change when the world really, really needs uranium?
Yeah, you know, we've dropped full-blown nuclear bombs on Japan. You know, we've done decades of test explosions and like the amount of radiation that we've poured into the environment through military applications swamps what could ever plausibly happen, even in worst case scenarios, at existing civilian nuclear facilities. But for some reason, like just take this Fukushima water nonsense that people are freaking out about. I drink that water. That water couldn't be more safe. And yet, we see the environmentalists, the anti-nuclear Malthusians, leaping at every opportunity to scare the living daylights out of people. And it works, because they believe that radiation is somehow a different form of pollution, when in reality, like every form of pollution, it's all a matter of dose. It's a matter of exposure times and concentration of that exposure. And so on it goes. Yeah, I would say the nuclear industry probably has a lot of culpability on its hands. It's done a particularly poor job of handling this onslaught of negative propaganda against it. Even by participating in, for example, the development of Yucca Mountain, we ran out of nines as far as the probability of anybody being hurt, 99.9999999, and on it goes. And yet, like Lucy's football, the environmentalists are always asking for another nine, and the industry plays along with that game by trying to find that extra nine. And then in so doing, it gives people who don't understand what's going on some pause. And they say, wow, if you have to build such an enormous facility underground with so many, barriers and redundancies baked into it, this must be a really dangerous thing. When in reality, nuclear waste is a non-issue. We like to say that if you believe nuclear waste is an issue, you're either a victim of propaganda or a knowing purveyor of it. There's just no other way to say it.
Is that these small modular reactors? What's stopping a shitload of them being deployed in Australian desert right now? Are they good enough to go already? Like, is that a practical solution right now?
Sure. We like to say there are no real technical challenges to the implementation of a nuclear renaissance. There aren't really financial challenges. Critics will argue that nuclear is, quote, too expensive and takes too long, and that's only because they spend every waking hour trying to make it more expensive and trying to slow it down as much as possible. SMRs are interesting to us in a way that very few people talk about. We wrote about SMRs in a piece called Gaining Steam not that long ago. SMRs have an extra attribute about them, well, two really interesting attributes that make them interesting in a way that few people are talking about. One, because they are fourth generation, typically technology, they can generate a fair bit of useful industrial steam. And for just as background, from our time in industry, a lot of these industrial brownfield behind the gate sites, they need both electricity and steam. And many of them obtain both of those commodities through what are known as cogeneration facilities. The most common embodiment being where you burn natural gas and you create both electricity and pretty useful steam. Something like 10% of the global carbon emissions are born out of the need to create industrial steam. Depending on the reactor design, you can get a fairly decent temperature of steam that is useful for many applications, not the highest temperature applications, but certainly it takes a big chunk out of the steam pyramid. And interestingly, the production of industrial steam accounts for more carbon emissions than the totality of our automotive and aviation emissions, which puts things into proper context. And the amount of airtime that we give electric vehicles versus this boring old need to produce steam is interesting. And then finally, the reason why SMRs work uniquely well in this case, because they have such a smaller radius of concern, let's say, than a big, large, old school nuclear reactor, you can pretty easily fit them within the confines of a pre-existing industrial site that already has security and so on, and with minimal concern for the surrounding area. And so small, embedded in industrial sites, producing both electricity and steam for the industrial processes that run our society today, we believe is an underappreciated bull scenario for nuclear in general and uranium in particular.
Doomberg. And
we profiled just one last comment. We profiled a really interesting project that's working its way through the approvals today between X Energy and Dow, where they're going to build an SMR inside one of these sites on the Gulf Coast of the U.S. Sorry, go ahead.
The fear of radiation aside, there are some other critiques that are commonly thrown when it comes to developing more nuclear facilities. They go along the lines of it costs too much to build, it takes too long to build. What's your educated critique to those party lines?
Yeah, so as mentioned earlier, the reason that it takes so long to build is because we have an endless stream of environmentalists suing to stop it. And the regulatory hurdles that these companies have to jump through are just incredible. These are political choices. So in the 1970s, Canada began a 20-year campaign and built a new nuclear reactor basically every year for 20 years. It was reasonably cost effective. The builds were done basically on time. If we could do it in 1970, then surely we can do it today. There are no technical challenges to doing this. It's, in our view, 100% concocted by anti-nuclear Malthusians who are doing everything they can to stop nuclear progress. And so the NRC in the US, for example, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is terribly anti-nuclear, and it's one of the key reasons why the nuclear technology has faded in the US to the extent that it has. You just can't get anything done. Now they've recently loosened up a bit, and the Biden administration has signaled that it supports nuclear power. We shall see if that manifests itself in the regulatory regime, which has been infiltrated by environmentalists. The head of the NRC meets with the Sierra Club on practically a weekly basis. These people have done everything in their power to make nuclear costly and slow. And then they turn around and say, let's not do nuclear because it's too costly and slow. This is the cynicism of the highest order.
Doomberg, I'm keen to move on to another form of energy, coal. So I'm not sure if you've followed this story, but here in Australia, the world's biggest miner, BHP, is looking to sell capital assets in Blackwater and Daunia. I'm keen to sort of hear your take on what the consequences are of first world listed companies, blue chip companies like BHP, being pressured to sell such assets.
The key word that you said in your question was listed. And we do believe that if enough pressure continues to be mounted through organizations like BlackRock and the vanguards of the world that aggregate passive investments and then use the voting power that comes from that to pressure boards to make changes, that you will force many of these companies into private hands. We don't believe that these coal mines will go out of business, but it is becoming ever more challenging to be a public company that is in the coal business. And you could see also in just the multiples that are assigned to these businesses that the market is not rewarding them for their profits. And so in such circumstances, either such mines close, which would be disastrous for a variety of reasons, or they end up going into private hands. And we do believe there'll be no shortage of private equity firms interested in ultimately taking on ownership of such facilities. Then the next wave or assault will come when critics of coal will attack their banking relationships and say that the banks shouldn't do business with, loan money to, or otherwise enable even privately held companies to run coal mines. That's coming. It's already an attack vector that we see worldwide. And so on it goes until, again, at such time that enough pain is felt and people realize that we have to get serious about creating technologies that can provide baseload power. We will continue down this sort of this silly little game, but that people are being forced to sell off assets in the name of climate change doesn't change the amount of carbon emissions. It merely changes who owns them. And in this case, have not dug into it too deeply, but I can only imagine that private bidders would be interested in these assets.
I think private is right in the context of private entities, private individuals, but private equity in the common term of private equity, they find it challenging because their LPs are US pension funds and the like who have similar mandates around fossil fuel exposure, especially thermal coal. So, but yeah, I mean, like your point on the multiples is something that we're watching relatively closely, and I think it's one of those market dislocations that is a result of the the kind of some of the absurdism in the energy market that you speak to a lot, I think.
Yeah. And private equity, put it this way, the harder it is to own, the more valuable it will be to the private owners who ultimately get it, right? It's just the way it works. Like the price elasticity demand of these commodities is such that, if you force a shortage, you'll make it up on price. And so I'll be looking into it now that you've brought it to my attention, but this is a very similar trend that we see in the US as well. And even though the LPs might be pension funds, there are no shortage of very wealthy individuals in the world who are looking to get a return. And we do believe that these assets will continue to be run for sure. And we're on pace to have a record production year. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not sure if this is sort of in the remit of all the stuff that you cover, but how do you then sort of think about if it were to go to like a private investor, how do you weigh, heightened government royalties and taxes? We've seen it in Queensland already here, one of the states in Australia, that, they just chuck on a, whatever they call it, a super tax or something like that out of the blue on such coal assets. Is there a sort of way or a framework of thinking you can do about that? I mean, this is supposedly a first world mining jurisdiction in Australia.
So such actions on the part of Western governments serve a few purposes. One, it serves the purpose of shunning new investment dollars away from the industry, which then creates shortages, which creates spikes in prices, which allows every other global producer to benefit from the marginal challenges that a country like Australia may be putting on its coal sector. So if you are a coal miner in Indonesia, you're praying for such windfall profit taxes to be imposed on your competitors, both because it directly raises the cost of coal, but also, again, scares away fresh investment dollars, which then leads to shortages. This is the cycle, right? In the commodity world, you make all your money on price during very narrow periods of time. When coal spiked over $400 a ton, people in the coal business were making a decade's worth of profit, right? And so such windfall profit taxes never work, but they never seem to go out of style. And so they're just a reality, a reality of participating in commodity markets, and sophisticated private investors have to go into it eyes wide open.
And do you think we get to a sort of point, say, 10 years down the track or something like that, where perhaps investment managers as well will change their mandates and might get to the point where these, legacy energy assets have produced such great returns for such an extended period? Can you sort of envisage anything like that?
It'll become a transition story, JD.
as we've touched on before.
There are always going to be some investors who are purely profit oriented and value maximizing. This is why cigarette companies have been such an amazingly profitable investment over the decades, as various other investors were prohibited from owning them. And if you reinvested your dividends in various large tobacco manufacturers, you would have done extraordinarily well over the decades. Not to to compare coal mining to the sale of cigarettes, but you could understand how sort of sin companies who are tossed into that bucket, justified or otherwise, become pretty good investments for people willing to plug their nose and seek a financial return. And history tells us that there's never a shortage of such people, and we don't see why it would be different here.
Doomberg, in our world, we're constantly looking at mining companies. So we're looking to produce a myriad of commodities, and quite a lot of those commodities pertain to the critical minerals needed to transition to renewable energy. And all of these companies put in, the first or second slide of their investor presentations, these charts that forecast the future demand for their commodity out to 2040, out to 2050.
Supply gap.
So there's a supply gap, but there's also these baked into these charts, these assumptions that are never questioned. They're just adopted, and no one ever questions them. But I'm guessing a lot of your work has taken a good dig into some of the absurd assumptions that are out there in relation to the energy transition, and I'd love to hear you speak to that.
It's a very interesting question, because despite these projections and mandates, in many instances, the market for such commodities is not consistent with the supply shortage that people are projecting, right? And why is that? It's a very interesting philosophical and market question. One potential answer is you will only use as much metals as you need as the constraining metal allows. And so imagine, a world where cobalt, nickel, and lithium and copper are all sort of commingled in this electrify everything campaign. If one of them is rate limiting, then you might overproduce the other three in anticipation of demand that literally can't be materialized because of a limiting constraint on the least, the slowest runner in the race. And so this is a possible explanation for some of the price movements that we've seen in recent years, where if the supply gap were truly going to materialize, you would expect prices to be far higher to signal to the market that more would be needed. It is a really interesting question. There is, of course, no way that we're going to be able to mine all these minerals to meet the projections and the mandates. And so that just means the projections and the mandates have to change, not necessarily the amount of mined material.
Even more broad than that, have you looked at some of the assumptions relating to, the proportion of energy that's going to be, consisted of renewable energy, and look at those long-term assumptions and just think, do they make sense?
Because they're not taking into account nuclear at all, are they? Is that
They're not taking into account the T equals zero energy that you need to build them in the first place either, which is why, of course, fossil fuels are still in the low 80s as far as total percent of primary energy produced worldwide, right? As much money as we've spent on renewables, the market share, let's say, of fossil fuels is unchanged over the decades, effectively. And that's because you can't run tractors on batteries. You have to run them on diesel, you're never going to see an electric plane of consequence carrying any people. Certainly, I wouldn't get on one. The jet fuel is going to be in high demand. We've written a piece called "Stuck in the Middle with You," I believe it was called, where we talk about the fact that all of the products that come from oil are basically subject to co-product economics, and even if we proliferate electric vehicles at the rate at which we are projecting, there's still an enormous number of gasoline vehicles on the planet. We still need to refine the same amount of barrels of oil to get the amount of diesel and jet fuel we need, which means the price of gasoline could go negative so that refiners could get rid of it. And in a world where gasoline goes negative, you could bet that all of the developing world that still have all of our old vehicles, which is where they go to die, will lap up every gallon of gasoline they could get their hands on, because energy is life and everybody wants a higher standard of living. And so, of course, these projections of how much renewable, quote unquote, energy we will need and use are completely, they're just nonsense. It won't happen. And so it presents all manner of investment opportunities, both on the long and the short side. But by 2040, we will be using more oil, natural gas, and coal than we do today. Of that, we're very certain.
And you've got a sort of thesis around societies should rather take up hybrid vehicles over electric vehicles to sort of, share the critical minerals that we have, the critical materials around. Can you sort of expand on how that sort of looks?
So, Management 101 is, if you have a constraint, you must manage to that constraint. And here, for the proliferation of electrified vehicles, the constraint is battery materials. And so, let's just take a very simple thought experiment. We take an 80 kilowatt hour battery that goes in a Tesla Model 3. That person who drives that Tesla Model 3 has abated 100% of their gasoline consumption. They still have to charge it at night, and depending on the carbon intensity of the grid, but let's ignore all of that for the purpose of this discussion. So with 80 kilowatt hours worth of battery, you can abate 100% of one person's driving their gasoline. If you split that battery into 4, and you make 4 plug-in hybrids, and you assume, since most people don't drive more than 40 miles on any particular day, that you abate 80% of each of their gasoline use. 4 times 80 is 320, and 320 is bigger than 100. And so with the same battery pack, you can abate 3.2 times the amount of gasoline if you spread it across plug-in hybrids as opposed to BEVs. The math is just simple. It's undeniable. It works even better if you spread it across soft hybrids, like Toyota has wisely done with the Prius. You can double the fuel economy of all the cars with the amount of batteries that we have today. Or you could concentrate them in things like the GM Hummer, or the Ford electric truck, which has these giant battery packs, which are basically vanity projects for rich people. And we can all pretend like we're doing something for the planet. Or we could get serious about actually looking at the engineering and the maths and say, if we have a finite amount of batteries, what is the very best way to abate the most amount of gasoline? And it is to spread those batteries across as many hybrid drivetrains as possible. It's just undeniable.
Okay. If you're going to say, what's worse for ozone depletion, burning coal to charge an electric vehicle, or mining oil and gas to fuel vehicles with petrol, diesel, and gas? What's worse for ozone depletion?
So ozone depletion actually is an artifact of man-made fluorinated compounds that are no longer a real issue. But broadly speaking, what's worse for carbon emissions and the global warming phenomenon, our view is every molecule of oil, gas, and coal will be burned by somebody somewhere. And so the thing that will constrain our carbon emissions is proactively constraining production. And yet people don't want to stop producing these materials. For example, if we take Europe, they produce almost no coal, oil, and gas. So their ability to actually affect how many molecules are burned around the world is de minimis because they don't produce any of it anyway. And so China is going to burn everything it produces. Indonesia is going to burn and sell everything it produces. Australia could stop producing. That would, if Australia stopped producing coal today, that would meaningfully reduce global carbon emissions. There's no question about it. If Australia stopped producing liquefied natural gas today, that would be a meaningful dent in carbon emissions. But every molecule produced will be burned somewhere, be it in the attempt to electrify a vehicle, as you say, or to put diesel into a giant shovel tractor that feeds, the mines all around the world. How we burn those materials is interesting, but the amount we'll burn is set by production.
Yeah, well, can you dumb that down for me? The difference in ozone depletion, carbon emissions, like how because I thought the carbon emissions are what deplete the ozone, which causes the global warming. What's the definition of all? I'm a bloody underground miner, mate. You might have to give me a bit of a 101 here.
I would say the depletion of the ozone layer, the ozone hole, the famous ozone hole from the 80s and 90s, is a similar phenomenon along the lines of acid rain, for example. These are pollution issues. They're not climate change issues. The carbon emission issue is feeding what's known as the sort of the greenhouse effect, right? Where more heat is trapped, and the planet gets warmer. Ozone depletion of the ozone layer was a specific consequence of fluorinated hydrocarbons that were used in things like air conditioning units and coolants and so on. And I believe the Montreal Protocol was the great conference where the world got together and put an end to this by simply implementing bans of certain synthetic materials, which were the correct thing to do and had the desired effect. And that is no longer a major issue. That's completely separate from carbon emissions and global warming effects. And then acid rain, of course, was just sulfuric acid, controlling industrial emissions and so on, and scrubbers, implemented across various energy and commodity production facilities have gone a long way to ending that problem as well. So there's a difference between pollution controls, which we're all for, and carbon emissions feeding the climate change narrative.
Well, there you go. That's general society for you, mate. It's people like me that actually don't know what the fuck's going on with how all this works. Ill-informed. So I'm much the wiser now for that. Thank you very much, Doomberg.
Yes, well, you informed me on the size of the uranium market, so it's only fair that we should trade.
Oh, good trade-off. Beautiful. Pleasure doing business. Cheers,
yeah, just to give you a bit more background, if you just Google Montreal Protocol, like I just did, it was 1987, a global agreement to protect stratospheric ozone layer by phasing out the production of called ozone depleting chemicals and mostly fluorinated hydrocarbons. When humanity introduces unnatural molecules into the environment, there's always the potential that we will do significant harm. And through the wonders of synthetic chemistry, we have an amazing ability to do that. And sometimes we make potentially catastrophic mistakes like we did. And oftentimes we're able to fix them like we did with the Montreal Protocol.
Hey, JD, can you read that article for me and summarize it and just let me know?
We'll get on
just
to
get
that
ChatGPT to do it.
Yeah. Doomberg, on your sort of personal investment kind of strategy, you've outlined a sort of 3-pillar approach in an article at one point, and that's sort of, earning money in fiat, saving by buying real assets, i.e. sort of gold, land, collectibles, and then investing privately where you can impact the outcome. I just want to dig a bit deeper on that third pillar that you mentioned there. How do you go about personally investing where you can, have an impact on the outcome?
Yeah, it's not for everybody. Of course, private investment in the U.S. in particular is limited to a subcategory of investors that are known as accredited investors. You have to testify that you have or sign off that you have a certain amount of net worth or a certain amount of annual income that allows you to participate in the private markets. We, in our consulting business, consulted a lot of sort of wealthy family offices and C-suite executives, at least before COVID hit. And in so doing, we got to be pretty familiar with the venture capital space and did a lot of work in that area. One member of our team has a substantial background in private equity as well. And so you need access to deal flow, and then you need to understand what makes for good deals and bad deals and good prices and bad prices. But we like to deploy our capital in concentrated bets on companies that we know personally, that we know the management teams of, that we can deploy our own expertise and network to help that company succeed. And we have found that it doesn't take too many winners if you invest early enough to make pretty amazing returns. And so it's not for everybody. There's huge risks. We've been stolen from. We've had things go to zero. We've had all manner of challenges, but we've had a few knock them out of the park wins that make up for an awful lot of losses. And broadly speaking, we're far more comfortable selecting companies that have a good chance to win, getting in early, helping management teams succeed, helping them with recruiting, with advice and so on, directly impacting the outcome of the situation, as opposed to trying to figure out which stocks will go up or down tomorrow based on what we read on Twitter.
Beautiful. And there was one more thing that stood out that I really wanted to ask you. So you've used this sort of term mass dissonance in the past, and you're sort of referencing this phenomena where entire societies believe things that, you know, they're provably at odds with physics. How do individuals avoid this herd behavior?
It's almost impossible, really. It is fascinating, of course, just in my own family. You know, my wife and children get their news from radically different sources than what we use as source material for Doomberg. And my wife, of course, reads every piece and is really amazed at how much she's learned and how different it is than what the Twitter algorithm feeds her as the news that they think she should be interested in.
My wife doesn't give a fuck about mining. She doesn't listen to any of our shit. So you got a good one, mate. Good one. Lucky you.
You know, it pays the bills. So one needs to pay attention to what pays the bills. And so the best way, you know, I will say the media's complete and utter failure in this regard is the market inefficiency that has allowed Doomberg to prosper. And so from that respect, we are they have our never-ending gratitude. We hope they keep screwing it up and misinforming people and leading to this sort of mass misunderstanding of these types of topics, because it is that exact inefficiency that we hope to occupy in the market as we created the Doomberg business.
Doomberg, I'm keen to get your views. In the past, you've drawn some parallels between the shale boom in the oil market, and you described it as cash incinerating. But you've compared it to direct lithium extraction technology, or DLE technology, that's emerging in lithium, or supposedly emerging in lithium. And you know, you in your words, you know, the more successful the technology, the quicker the commodity glut forms, and all commodity producers are nothing more than price takers with elevated fixed costs. I'm curious to have you elaborate on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And it is undeniable that commodity producers, when new technologies allow them to produce more, can't help themselves but create these gluts. And so, in our view, it is a far superior investment strategy to look for the underlying technologies that allow such production increases to occur, the suppliers of such technologies for our investment dollars, because they win no matter what. And so, for example, during the shale boom, as you mentioned, you know, hardly any producer of oil and gas in the shale patch returned a reasonable cost of capital to the original investors, and many of them went bankrupt, famously after the COVID-19 lockdowns were implemented. But the producers of the sand and the surfactants and the technologies and the services that allowed all of this growth to occur did just fine. And in the piece you referenced, where we talked about direct lithium extraction technologies, we would be far more interested in understanding who the developers are of the membranes and other associated consumables that make this technology breakthrough possible, and would potentially allow the world to create as much lithium as it needs vis-a-vis the projections we discussed earlier. The actual producers of lithium themselves, should such technologies proliferate, have nothing but a multi-decade glut of lithium to sell into, to look forward to, and would make for particularly poor investments in our view, just like the shale producers in the late teens were here in the U.S.
Beautiful. We really appreciate your time, Doomberg, and all the sort of elaborate explanations and answers you went into to our detailed questions. And I'm sure the money miners will get a heap of value from that. We'll chuck a link to your Substack and Twitter